Right, and we're live at 6 p.m. Eastern, Sunday, the 9th of August. Welcome to another Unmissable Sunday show. Hi, Benny, back from St. Bart's, looking a
Back
bit
from St.
tan.
Bart's, bought a new mic, so we don't have any more issues, guys. Although I do blame that on Hugh. Sorry about that in the last show.
I think the shaman should be promoted to Minister of Telecommunications for the Caribbean, and then he can fix the Wi-Fi. But anyway, listen, we are going AI heavy this weekend. I spent last week trying to basically put some numbers behind Sam and Dario's heavy lift. The idea really is that if you look at the, if you like, the economic underwriting of all of this hyperscaler CapEx boom, it's essentially built on the spending of these two private companies, Anthropic and OpenAI. All right. Yes, there are other foundation labs around, but ultimately it's the spending of these two tenants of the data centers that's underwriting everything. And so whether you're a memory bull, whether you're fighting about whether or not the hyperscaler is going to return to free cash flow positive P&Ls, it's all based on whether or not these guys can pay, and also whether or not these guys can get public at a valuation and with a liquid currency that can support continued further capex, right? So
Yeah,
essentially you need to understand, one, what these companies are really worth today, and what the sort of steady state P&L for them looks like. That's got to, underwrite the constant continued capex, which is really opex for those businesses. You fall behind on the state of the art front pretty quickly in foundation model land.
You do. It is a very, very competitive market. Let's just put it that way. And it's moving so fast that, like, I mean, I think as everyone who watches this knows, I'm involved with an AI company, and like just the amount that's changed in the last 8 months is just incredible, honestly. Like, and it's still changing. And like, so we're going to give you a first shot valuation, but just keep in mind that, like, this is not like valuing a shoe company. Like the the economics, the economics and the dynamics are changing, and there's 3 wars going on. You have the China war versus the US, the open source or the local versus the cloud, and then the intra cloud. And no one's going to be able to tell you, including anybody at any of those places, exactly how this will play out.
Yeah, and listen, just a reminder, we've got these spending commitments from the hyperscalers that are laid out here, and this Goldman put together this interesting chart. I mean, these two charts are really saying the same thing. So much of this capex and depreciation is yet to be visible because the clock doesn't start ticking until the data center becomes operational. So you've got all of this cost lurking in the background. And at the same time, right, if you look at, and we talked about this a little bit, if you decompose these headline beats by the hyperscalers, I mean, this is Google's, the markups on their stakes in this case, Anthropic and SpaceX, were all of the beat, right?
We put a great meme out about that the day it happened.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think it, it warrants doing the work. Now, back in April, when we were starting to talk about SpaceX, right? And remember, we did the valuation back then, right? We decided that Starlink and the launch business were pretty straightforward to value because they are, ARPU times number of subs in the case of Starlink, and then you have you can forecast a number of external launches for SpaceX, i.e., ones that aren't serving Starlink, and then put some numbers around that. And then really for XAI, we kind of phoned it in, right? In our case, we just took the XAI SpaceX merger value from February, right? As a base case.
Just one caveat to that. I think that when we look at it now, the Cursor acquisition was actually a really good acquisition. Like I'm using Grok 4.5 a decent amount now, since Rupert and I have to have the blue checks. We get that. Rupert's such a fundamentalist, he refuses to use it, but like it's actually pretty good. And it went from being not even on the playing field. It's basically like if you ever saw the movie Hoosiers, where Ollie comes in and wins the game for them at the end. I know this is probably not Rupert's thing because he doesn't like basketball and he's not American, but like a lot of people watching knows it's equivalent of that. They came out of nowhere and now they have a competitive model. So XAI has been revalued up in my mind. But you know, again, we gave them the benefit of the doubt off the shoot.
Okay, but rewind right now. I mean, we had SpaceX's maiden earnings last week, and really just to tie back to the earlier point, you know, this jumbo build out that they've announced for in terms of gigawatts for the next 18 months. I think that kind of spooked people some. I mean, it's compounding the issue, right? And again, you know, they are leaning on Anthropic and OpenAI as tenants. Now, back in March, April, when we were doing the valuation, you know, Anthropic was valued at a relatively humble, I think, $400 billion, and an OpenAI somewhere close. Now, you're looking at a very different order of magnitude. In the last round valued OpenAI at $852 billion. And the Series H for Anthropic the other day valued it at 965, right? So, you know, these are real numbers, right? Certainly in the case of Anthropic, we're looking at a targeted 2026 IPO. So these numbers need to start getting tested. And that is in the context of as we touched on earlier, some real competition, right?
Yeah, so this is a good chart. This is a good chart because as we talked about, whenever I went on a tyrant about the atomic unit of AI ROI, that it's a task, right? You don't measure your journey in gallons. You measure it in the cost to get to St. Bart's, the cost for me to get to Melbourne to visit the squirrel. Like, you don't really care what the unit like variable cost is. And what we're seeing here is the traditional Pareto curve. You know, frontier risk reward, same thing, or you know, utility of wine versus cost of wine. So we see like Fable and Opus 4.5 out on the or 5 out on the right, but DeepSeek V4 came out and it was a massive dump, like in terms of deflation. And then now you had OpenAI drop their prices, and my buddy Brandon Carl wrote a really great piece. You guys should follow him on Substack. And he like basically we're just talking like this curve, we're keep trying to push that upper left, and so we'll talk about it a little bit when we talk about token economics, but like this is not exactly something that you're looking at and you're being like, oh, I really feel really good about Anthropic here sitting at the highest price by far on the curve. And yeah, they have the best models, but not by like a wide margin. Look at that.
Yeah, and it's showing up in the usage data, right? So this is the OpenRouter token usage data, and so just last week, in terms of token consumption, DeepSeek was 130% of OpenAI and Anthropic combined last week, right? So I mean, and you know, we've already seen OpenAI cut prices on a lot of their models in response to this, and you know this is happening at a hairy time when you come to think about valuation.
One caveat to this that I would add, because when I was in St. Bart's, I was teaching a guy who was a client of Hughes there, and you got to remember, you can go to OpenRouter and they classify it by task, so they show you of like the 14 taxonomy tasks that they have, what the most popular models are by task. Because remember when I talked about that is like different tasks, different models, and that's an important thing. So the aggregate, which Rupert just showed, doesn't tell the exact story. But like, yes, people like more for less is the way I would view that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes perfect sense. And you know, it's going to depend on the sophistication level of the user, right?
Yes,
and people
correct.
that have got their harnesses set up so that easy tasks get automatically routed to the cheap model, and they just reserve their token budget for really tough stuff, right?
Yeah.
You know, you don't go to Fable for a chili con carne recipe.
And I think that's the one like bridge of disconnect in the market right now is there's still a lot of usage. Like the 1% of users who use 50% of the tokens, they know what they're doing. Okay. But the 50% of users who are kind of like JV players but are in the game, who, you know, it's still better deal for them than hiring off of Fiverr or, you know, whatever. Like the price structure still collapsed on a lot of the like things. But like basically you have to remember that we're in a situation now where these guys will get better. Like I can, you know, I think there's going to be a lot of people who are going to in the next year go from novice, I don't know what I'm doing, to, you know, middle of the curve users. Like, but remember, it's middle of the curve is kind of much more to the right. So I would just say that like everyone's going to get more efficient, like every week probably.
Okay, I'm just going to talk about the model for a second, and I'm just going to share a screen for a second, and we're going to put a copy of this in the show notes, so you can see that, Benny, right? So I mean, essentially, really simple. What?
I cannot see it.
You cannot? Okay, let me just try that.
But just as Rupert finds that, he wrote a initial note where it took a little stab at the first valuations the same way we did with SpaceX, as he mentioned. Obviously, both the filings aren't out. We don't have Ed Zitron's insider guy giving us the financials, but this is based on, you know, the data we have.
Listen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the Excel in the show notes so people can play through it. But essentially, let me outline what I did. Right, I modeled 4 scenarios for both Anthropic and OpenAI, ranging from on the bear side, you know, the wipeout scenario where they just sort of collapse in on themselves as they never get to a positive contribution market. And we'll talk about contribution margins in detail with your tokenomics. And then on the bull case, you're looking at sort of Anthropic doing 450 yards of EBITDA in 2030, right? And putting appropriate multiples on that, and then doing an expected value, a probability weighted weighting of those 2030 valuations, and then discounting them back to today. Tops of trees, I reckon that OpenAI's last private round is probably 25% above where I see that probability weighted expected value today for the business. Anthropic's 965 is just marginally 8 to 10% above where I am now. The point there is that, God damn it, you know, when I used to take a lot of companies public, there was something called an IPO discount, and ultimately, you know, you want to be growing into a valuation as you become public. And they're looking to come out with something which is, you know, where everything, the best of all possible worlds is frankly already baked into the price.
Can we talk about that for a second real quick? Because it's an interesting you say that. Like, OpenAI was very obviously to us fully valued, if you will, at 135. They jacked it up to 215. You know, and I think I talked about it. But
SpaceX,
like,
you're talking about SpaceX. Just back up.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, SpaceX. And I waited for the options to open, and then I put on that back spread, which was pretty good, 150, 120, where you got a 4-to-1 convexity on it. And is that a fake move? Like, was that obviously it wasn't really a discount, but like, is that like, you know, how do you think about that? Like, what was that move? It was like a 3-day move, and then it went down almost every day until earnings. I mean,
so I think what happened here is I mean, you had a classic Elon move. Don't overthink it. Think it. Don't try to justify it. Yeah, we were being curmudgeonly bears around the story, and, you know, like idiots focusing on valuation, and just everyone piled in and bought it, right? On a very thin float, number go up, right? Then what's happened? Listen, when even CNN is talking about IPO lockups, right? ultimately the whole world, yeah, the whole world got onto the sort of common knowledge business around supply, right? And then, just in line with earnings, where massive headlines about, the billion dollar number coming forward by a year, the billion dollar number coming forward by a year, massive bullish investment numbers around CapEx. And that's when, the hand of God jammed the listed option chain. And so that's the spike that we saw last week.
Well, that was the
Everyone was
blow off, right? The day that options came out was the top.
well, no, I'm talking about last week now, right? And
Okay.
I'm talking about last week now around the earnings, and that was the textbook gamma squeeze, which we had to assume that was coming. But ultimately, I've heard it from several sources that there's been delays in some of these pre-IPO shares getting into brokerage accounts. So did we see a lot of selling yet? No, probably not. I mean, for me, it's still a do not touch stock. But getting back to OpenAI and Anthropic, and again, the model will be in the notes, and you can play with my assumptions. And I'd love feedback on what were missed. Now, one of the scenarios that I didn't price, right, was the AGI scenario. Now, $87,000 worth of volume on AGI by a certain date on Calci is not really swinging my opinion very much. We've talked a lot about whether LLMs are a path to AGI. I'm certainly on the skeptical front there. But in terms of the economic model where they have created digital God, I think you need to be really careful of what kind of numbers you can put around these foundation model companies if they do even achieve that, because you get revenue and profit scaling issues, right? Even in a world where intelligence is only defined by availability of energy and compute, right? At the end of the day, there is a limit to the share of economic growth that Skynet can take. And so I actually think that the bull cases for my models probably represent the sort of the cap on a rational valuation for these businesses. And I developed that AGI argument in a bit more detail in my note that was out on Saturday.
Yeah, and I would just add that like an LLM transformer is just not the model that's going to get you there. Like,
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Yeah.
It's not, when you understand the mechanics of it, and like you see the societal pushback already, the data centers getting, said no to, the fact that it's like, why would we give all our power and energy to this? And then when you learn how to do graph engineering or loop engineering, you realize like how much it uses to get there, because it's all recursive. It's not like it knows it does. It kind of has to keep computing in order to get to a really good answer. And it's amazing that it can, to be fair. But yeah, this is not going to be, it's not going to be AGI. Like, this isn't what's going to get us there.
Yeah, I mean, and also just another simple way to look at it is that even if it did get there, right? Even if it did get there, there are still going to be tasks, whether it's as simple as laying the electric cabling and pouring the cement to build the next data center, or getting planning permission, or anything that involves sort of a human gate, whether it's for compliance or empathy, heaven forbid. Ultimately, the costs of those tasks are going to go through the roof, right? And if AGI is coming for the 30 trillion of global white collar payroll, who's paying for all this, right? So that sort of that caps the scaling to the upside as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, I spoke about this, like, this concept of Jevons paradox. You got to remember that like England doesn't even use any coal power anymore. And like, it ran off the exponential. And so there's 4 ceilings, and we talked about this, so I don't need to go into it, but like it's like human capacity, then it's the thermodynamic ceiling, then it's the like basically the substitution, something that's better than it, and then it's what Rupert's talking about. The final ceiling is, oh, you're 80% of global GDP, like that's the final ceiling.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about token economics. And Ben's put together some slides here, which I think are useful to run through, because people start banding around sort of cost per million tokens, etc. But I think this really needs to be framed properly, because not all tokens are the same.
Yeah, so we'll have, for our paying subscribers, we'll give the full deck, but I included a couple key ones here. And you got to think about these, like the power plant's actually a decent analogy. So, you build a power plant, it generates power, or it takes in energy, whether it's from the sun or it's, uranium or it's coal, and it generates electricity, which then increases your standard of living. Very similar to this, right? And not surprising that power is the big constraint and the big thing for these things. So think of electricity produced as tokens, the actual capital as the chips and the cooling and the data center shell, and then basically what your utility charges you as the token price, like, so your cost of using the utility. And thus, you've heard a lot of people say these are LLMs are actually utilities, because they kind of are, right? So, it's a two-pronged utility, in the sense that the hyperscalers are making bets that they're the power generators, and there's the LLMs are some kind of weird transmission line, I guess would be the way you would think about it. And which is funny, because actually they make all their money on transmission lines, where we'll decide, or we'll see if the LLM frontier models can actually make money. But like, just so everyone knows, like the initial freak out in SaaS was because if you have a line of code that, or a lot of lines of code that become a program, the incremental or marginal cost of a new user is almost zero. And that's why these things got astronomical valuations over the years, because all you really were worried about is, how much do I got to pay a sales guy or marketing or whatever your customer acquisition strategy was, versus the incremental seat. But then, really, and then what's the churn? Because that,
yeah, absolutely. And so this is the thing. If you think about it in industrial terms, right? In V 2.0 SaaS, the contribution margin was the EBITDA margin, right? Okay, we have some fuckery around stock-based compensation getting in the way of true EBITDA, but this is Silicon Valley.
Fair. But also remember now. Go ahead, keep going. Sorry.
But ultimately, in a world of LLMs, you've got a mobile variable cost in the form of inference, and ultimately, unless you can really smash down the cost of inference going forward, this is not the SaaS analogy just does not work, because the contribution margin is always under threat.
And go to the next slide, and I want to talk about the concept that why it's like a power plant, in the sense that like the token capacity, if you don't use it, it perishes. The same way that if why nuclear doesn't work, right? Why did Exelon like complain constantly? It's because they were generating at 100% overnight, where people weren't using power. Whereas like wind and even gas and coal, coal's the slowest, but that's only a couple hours. Wind is almost instant. Solar, like these in gases, within a couple minutes, they can dynamically adjust their capacity versus demand, right? Which is why if you ever meet a power trader like my buddy Tom, our friend of the show, Tom Jens, those guys pay attention to the weather, because that is the number one driver of variance in electricity demand. But so let's go through this real quick. So gross profit, because if you talk to an AI bull, like I was talking to a buddy at a big tech hedge fund, one of the biggest, and they're like, well, the inference gross margins are almost 80%. Well, that's the contribution margin, right? That doesn't include the R&D team. That doesn't include the training costs. What was the acronym you were using?
So this is the one that the AI spokesfolks are bandying around, which is EBTIT, right? Which I think is going to age as bad as well as community adjusted EBITDA did for WeWork. This is earnings before training, interest and tax. And you can't training these models, which increasingly you're having to do once every 3 to 6 months, is OPEX. It's not one-off CapEx. It can't be stripped out.
Yeah. So just so we're clear, tokens. So that's how many tokens you sell times the average token price, which I can get into a little bit, but understand that that's not just the listed price, because it's a blended of API plus the subscription. And remember, subscription is wildly variable margins. Think about it like all you can eat buffet. Fat Albert, hey, like that guy's killing you. Whereas Rupert and I, that makes a little bit of money on us on the all you can eat buffet. And so that's a very hard dynamic that you have to understand. And then the gross margin is uncertain at this point, but basically you're going to have a situation where this first is the demand engine, second is the supply engine. So token supply equals hardware. So all Jensen's product, other guys are entering the fray. And then what Rupert talked about, the inference share versus the training model share. You think about inference as like, that's the incremental cost of providing the service. The training is like creating the service, like the cost of creating the shoe factory. And so it isn't surprising that they're trying to like create a profitability metric that excludes the cost of actual creating that. And then remember the slide we showed you before of like how models keep getting better. It's not like this is a 20-year factory making, magazine paper, like, or shoes or steel. Like, who's using ChatGPT 4 these days? And then, the token yield is the final like part of that. And that's a big efficiency gain. So ultimately we're coming down to a situation where is cost going to keep dropping faster, like than demand, or than, the demand. So here's the first one. Tokens served per million. I think most people are generally like aware of that, or price per million, I guess. So tokens, then times the gross margin, that's your gross profit. And then basically go to the next one.
Mm-hmm.
This gets a little bit better. This is exactly what we just showed. Like token yield is the usable tokens produced per hour, and the inference share is what we just talked about. And so you have to think about these two things as two exponential curves, and which curve's moving faster than the other. And that's really where the game's being played. So everybody gets like in their mind, they're like, oh, demand's exponentially growing. Okay, fine. But like, what is like of those two curves, what's moving faster? Is supply or demand moving faster? And you go economics 101, demand supply is what's going to determine profitability, price, especially in a market that has enormous capital costs combined with global competition. It's not like this is like the internet where it was just Silicon Valley game. You know what I mean? Like this is China's involved. I actually subscribe to a Japanese model. I'm sure the Europeans will get off the mat. There is a German model that's okay. Like, point is, it's not only that, it's local models are becoming a thing. When I was in St. Bart's, I had an AI engineer say that she's at a startup, that AI startup, they're using more and more local. I think Apple's stock price reflects that Siri will go from just not that smart to being Opus 4.6 or Opus 4.8 or like, something that's decent, that $200 price increase will just be year one, right?
Yeah, and locally installed on your phone. Yeah, spell that out in a bit more, because we talked about this at length yesterday.
Right. So Apple did a 20% price increase. And like, I think if you were just like, oh, what are you giving me for $200 incremental? That's a huge inflation. But I think that it will feel less if you have a local Opus 4.8 model on your phone that works pretty well, and you don't have to pay $20 per month. Because like Rupert, what is that? It's $240 a year, and there's your price increase, and then everything you use beyond that accrues to you, kind of like a car or an oil well or any of these things where you pay for the first year or two of value, and then you accrue the tail, more or less.
Yeah. I think, I kind of, I mean, if Apple wasn't already so goddamn expensive for a pretty meh growth rate, I'd get much more excited about this. But with hindsight, they're going to look to have played this phase pretty well.
Yeah, I don't know if that was luck or skill, but like they definitely look good now. And then we have this concept of perishability, of just creating more capacity. So when everyone's like, oh, I want to own Vistra, I want to own Nvidia, like, because everyone needs more compute. Well, when are people using compute? How are they routing the compute? Like, and as we talked about earlier in the show, like, people are going to get better at all this. There is this perishability to the compute, just like there is to power generation, which is why there's not been a whole lot more power. And remember, if you ever look at the PJM, which is the biggest power grid in America, they constantly have had higher demand forecasts than realized. Big part of it was LED lights got introduced, smart electronics got introduced, smart fridges, better LED lights in TVs and computer screens. Like, and again, don't short engineers. Like, guys are going to optimize, right? And so, the bottom line here is that it's a margin race. It's, will the costs drop faster than the prices are dropping? And competition is what drives prices, and yields and innovation is what drives the cost down. And this is the key question to like focus on as we go forward, because ultimately demand is going to grow. So don't like get sucked into that, because I think that's the big trick, is that like demand growing will be this bugaboo, right? Like that it's like, oh, I'm using it more, and then agents, and then only this percentage of people. But I think we can go back to Rupert, like, this is the fastest diffused technology ever. My mom uses Claude and Grok. I mean, she still watches the nightly news. You know what I mean? Like, so if my boomer mother is already on two models, and actually, Rupert, talk to the consumer part of it. That's actually a good thing to like add on here, because I think, and then we'll touch on the enterprise too, and then we'll
I mean, and this really comes through in the modeling and the difference between modeling OpenAI and Anthropic. Obviously, there's an argument that OpenAI has got to a position in consumer AI consumption that Google got to in search. And the question is, to what extent can they continue to fund consumer inference, to the extent that they are, right? I mean, your mum looking up a chili recipe on ChatGPT, is not what, and her writ large, lots of Ben's mums around the world, OpenAI is subsidizing all of that.
And can they, if it's on your iPhone as part of your cost of your new iPhone, you're losing that business right there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that's why my valuation exercises, extracts a much higher penalty on OpenAI. But then, the enterprise business is really at risk of becoming McKinsey, right? Because ultimately, these super powerful LLMs that the foundation labs produce, maybe they just get introduced as a kind of delta force for fixing problems that enterprises have got with their self-hosted open source, because they don't want to share all their data with the share all their data with the foundation labs. And so we're already talking about forward deployed engineers for both Anthropic and for OpenAI right now. This is scarily sounding like becoming a sort of consulting type business, and we know how those scale.
And the thing that we need to remember is that we're finding data security is super important. So in the enterprise, it's consumer don't care. I mean, maybe they care, but they're not going to put the effort and time, or maybe they don't even know how. Like, but like an enterprise, like the data security is like number one. And with the Trump administration, as it is kind of Silicon Valley favorable, there's a trend to moving your data where you're like storing it outside of the US, not a good sign. And also of like, maybe we want to live above, and I think I've talked about this a number of times, the upper stack. Like, you're not exactly like, we're just going to give it to Anthropic or we're going to give it to OpenAI. Like, we'll use them. But even OpenRouter already has a model where you can put 3 or 4 models in there, see what the result is for each of them, just put your task in there. And so this is just starting, right? Like this concept of like, the models are a commodity. Like that's why I started with the power plant. Like you want to put a super multiple on a commodity. We did that before when you go back 100 and some years of electricity and go see how that worked out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing is that the Fortune 1000 global enterprise, right, they're not going to make the same mistakes as they did handing over all of their customer data to Salesforce, right? They're not going to get that data lock-in, right? They've learned from that mistake in the past, and I think they're going to be super sensitive around how they construct their AI usage as a result of that.
And
so
you know what's a good go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was just saying, you know what is a good analogy of that? When I was a young analyst, Fidelity, I was one of the largest theater owners, and I was trying to figure out, and I used to sit in Reed Hastings' office a couple times at Netflix when they were trying to turn from a DVD to streaming. The movie industry was not interested in being Napstered the way the music industry was. So Rupert's point is very good that like once you've seen it, you already have like a visual analogy in your head of like, we're not doing that again. So like, I think that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, so please, please check out the show notes. So that's available for both Benny and my subscribers. I would love feedback. I'd love particularly to hear for where I'm wrong on the bull case. The bear case is pretty easy to model, right? Because that's just widget math, right? But I want to really understand where I'm wrong on the bull case. And in the meantime,
I'll put the full deck. I'll put the full deck of the token economics on there and Rupert's model. So there's actually a good extra episode here for you guys.
It's a good bundle. It's a good bundle, and I think also more importantly, than just valuing two private companies that you can't buy or sell yet. Let's not underscore, just how much of the AI value chain is predicated on these businesses being worth $1 trillion, right? And sustainable and growing $1 trillion companies. And I just think the jury is absolutely still out on that.
I mean, because think about it. SpaceX has a lease with Anthropic for $1.25 billion a year. They got Google has 2027 clouds, 50% is Anthropic. So I was looking at a CoreWeave deal, and these guys have and OpenAI as a key part of the credit. So if these guys fail, this transmission mechanism is violent. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's really violent. These two companies are the anchor tenants, either one of them, on any big CapEx bill out there right now. And the economic model is far from fully tested.
Yeah, and also just let's remember, we're still in this subsidized period, right? Like, so there's a ton of, there's so many startups that are using this stuff funded by people. There's so many people who don't know how to use this stuff, as I've hammered on a lot on this show over the last 2 months, like harnessing, optimization, route optimization, etc. And it's only going to get better as the cost per token, as we showed the curve. Like, this is not a place where you want to be like thinking about it like it's steel, is all I'm trying to tell you. Like, this is a dynamic, and the China component of it really throws a wrench, because we didn't have an international competition before like this. So it is a unique beast that we've never seen before, that has a lot of capital behind it, with heavy capital and a price war, an international war, and even an intra-cloud war. So be careful.
Recipe for capital misallocation and some capital destruction. Listen, we'll leave it there. Have a great week, everyone. Inflation numbers this week, and I mean, you know, listen, the war trudges on. Apparently, we're just gonna what was it? We're just gonna play it light.
Low key it. We're gonna low key it.
We're gonna low key the straight this week. Let's see how that works. Anyway, good luck out there. Benny and the Squirrel are out.